What if I told you that one of the most brutal executions in English history wasn't carried out on a battlefield or in the heat of rebellion, but on a 67-year-old woman who had spent 2.5 years rotting in the Tower of London? A woman whose only crime was having the wrong bloodline in Tudor England? This is the story of Margaret Pole, the last of the Plantagenets, and the execution so botched, so horrific, that it would haunt Henry VIII for the rest of his reign. Before we dive into that blood-soaked morning in 1541, you need to understand who Margaret Pole was, because her story isn't just about one woman's death. It's about the systematic destruction of an entire royal bloodline. Margaret Pole wasn't just any noblewoman. She was born Margaret Plantagenet in 1473, daughter of George, Duke of Clarence. Yes, that Clarence, the one who supposedly drowned in a butt of wine. Her uncle, Richard III, her other uncle, Edward IV. This woman had more royal blood in her veins than Henry Tudor ever did. And here's what makes this even more chilling. For most of her life, Henry VIII actually liked her. When he became king, he restored her titles, made her Countess of Salisbury, one of the wealthiest women in England. She was even governess to his daughter Mary. They were friends. So what changed? What turned a trusted friend into a condemned woman facing the executioner's block? The answer lies in one word: paranoia. By the 1530s, Henry VIII had become a man obsessed with eliminating any threat to his dynasty. And Margaret Pole? She represented the ultimate threat: legitimate Plantagenet blood. But the real catalyst wasn't Margaret herself. It was her son, Reginald Pole. Reginald was everything Henry hated: brilliant, popular, and worst of all, he had the audacity to criticize the king's break with Rome. When Henry split from the Catholic Church to marry Anne Boleyn, Reginald wrote a scathing treatise, calling Henry a heretic and a tyrant. Henry was furious. He wanted Reginald dead, but there was one problem. Reginald was safely in Europe, beyond Henry's reach. So Henry did what tyrants do. He went after the family. In 1538, Henry had Margaret's other sons executed. But Margaret? She was too prominent, too well connected to simply murder outright. So he found another way. In November 1538, on the flimsiest of evidence, basically some correspondence that could be interpreted as treasonous if you squinted hard enough, 65-year-old Margaret Pole was arrested and thrown into the Tower of London. Now, here's what's truly horrific about this. Henry didn't even bother with a proper trial. Margaret was condemned by an act of attainder. Essentially, Parliament just declared her guilty because the king said so. No evidence presented, no defense allowed. Just a legislative death sentence. For 2.5 years, this elderly woman, once one of England's most powerful nobles, was left to rot in a cold, damp cell. 2.5 years of psychological torture, knowing that her death was inevitable, but not knowing when. And then, on May 27, 1541, that wait finally ended. Picture this. It's early morning on the Tower Green. Margaret Pole, now 67 years old, frail from years of imprisonment, is led out to face her death. But here's where this story takes a turn from tragic to absolutely horrifying. The regular executioner, the guy whose job it was to cleanly behead people, wasn't available. So they used a stand-in, an amateur. Margaret was told to kneel and place her head on the block. But according to witnesses, and remember this is documented history, she refused. At 67 years old, after 2.5 years in prison, Margaret Pole looked at her executioner and essentially said, "If you want my head, you'll have to take it." What happened next was butchery. The inexperienced headsman swung his axe and missed her neck entirely, gashing her shoulder. Margaret was still alive, still conscious. She tried to run, A 67-year-old woman, bleeding from a massive wound, tried to escape around the scaffold while the executioner chased her with his axe. It took 11 blows. 11! Each swing more desperate than the last, each one adding to what witnesses described as a scene of unimaginable horror. By the end, it wasn't an execution, it was a murder scene. The execution was so brutal, so obviously wrong, that it shocked even Tudor England, a place not exactly known for its squeamishness about public executions. And Henry VIII, the man who ordered this atrocity, even he seemed to realize he'd gone too far. Witnesses reported that he never spoke of Margaret Pole's execution afterward, and some historians believe it contributed to his increasingly paranoid and unstable behavior in his final years. But here's the ultimate irony. Margaret Pole, the woman Henry tried to erase from history, ended up outlasting him in the most profound way possible. The Catholic Church beatified her, declared her blessed, one step away from sainthood, recognizing her as a martyr who died for her faith. Henry VIII, the man who killed her? Well, history remembers him as a tyrant. Margaret Pole? She's remembered as a symbol of courage in the face of tyranny. Margaret Pole's execution represents something darker than just one woman's death. It shows us what happens when power becomes absolute, when paranoia replaces justice, and when political convenience matters more than human dignity. Her story deserves to be remembered, not just as a footnote in Henry VIII's reign, but as a testament to the cost of tyranny and the courage of those who refuse to bow to it. What do you think? Was Margaret Pole's execution the worst judicial murder in English history? Let me know in the comments below. And if you want to hear more stories about the forgotten victims of Tudor England, make sure to subscribe and hit that notification bell.